two areas are, number one, trade and integration, and number two, the development and sustainability. So when we're picking the questions out, looking for the command words, those are the two areas of the spec, the right hand side. Candidates should be able to, you need to be looking in those two areas. I think, given the length of this extract, given the content of the extract, and it's really split into two, you'll see this when we have a look at it, it really is kind of, there are two sort of separate and distinct components to extract 3. I think it's reasonable to assume that there'll be a 4-mark question at the start and there'll be a 6-mark analysis question to follow. The first paragraph really gives you an indication as to the first section of the, I guess, the assessment that's going to take place within this particular extract. So at the end of the first paragraph, it talks about improving development, and you're then presented with this data set, which you can see behind me. So this table at the top. Now I was talking to a few people earlier, and they were saying to me, we've never heard about HDI before, Human Development Index. We know all about GDP. We know all about GDP per capita as a means of assessing standard of living, but we're not too familiar with this thing called the Human Development Index. If you're not too familiar with it, the Human Development Index is a broader measure than simply looking at GDP per capita as a means of assessing standard of living. And the Human Development Index looks at 3 things. So it looks at GDP per capita, it looks at your life expectancy, and it looks at adult literacy rates. And basically you've got all 3 of those things in that table behind me. Just as a sort of a little side note here, as a little nota bene, as it were, note well. This is the section of the extract material that the exam board issued the erratum notice for, so the errors in the original. So if you're looking at a table which doesn't have those numbers in it, especially the ones along the bottom, you've probably got the wrong copy of the pre-release. You haven't got the most up-to-date copy. It's just a point of information, really, more than anything. So we can tell a number of things from this data set, and I just want to quickly explain to you what those things are. So obviously the focus here is on Zambia, and the remaining part of this extract really does focus primarily on the Zambian economy. We happen to have, at school here, we happen to have a member of staff who has lived and worked in Zambia he lived and worked there for about 3.5 years. I've done a little interview with him, which I've posted. You can have a look, it's 25 minutes long or something like that. And it gives a real nice sort of, you wouldn't need necessarily to know the backgrounds to the Zambian economy, but just sort of sets it in context quite well. Mr. Sims, who was here just this morning and welcomed you all, our member of senior management, he lived and worked there for 12 years. So I hope to do something similar with him. So there'll be some, I hope, greater detail coming on that. So the Zambian economy, as you know, it's a developing economy. Life expectancy, you can see, is improving, so they are making great strides in that respect. It's the next set of data which is really important, I think. Obviously, it's important that we have in an economy, if you wish to develop skills and productivity and for the economy to grow, it's really important that you all come to school, for example. And it's really important that you come to school, not just at primary school age, but secondary school age. And Zambia is making great strides in terms of the proportion of people who are going to primary school and having some primary school education. But of course, in the data, as you can see, there is a slight anomaly there, because primary school enrolment in 2007 is 119%, and in 2013 it's 108%. And you can see in the footnote to the extract 3, it is telling you that this is a combination of primary school age kids, but also adults who have missed out on their primary school education and are catching up on those primary school years. Now you can't tell what that mix is from that number, 119, 108. You don't know whether that is 50% primary school age and 58% adults, you don't know. So, it'd be worth obviously saying that if you do get a question on this. The mean years of schooling, this means, for example, you people, you will all start school, I guess, around the age of 5. And you'll all go to school until you're 18. So the mean years of schooling in the UK is probably 13 years. So you start at age 5 and you finish at 18. This table is telling you that in the year 2000, kids in Zambia were starting school around about age 5, and they were only spending about 6 years in school. So by the time they were 11, they had actually finished their education. That was it. In 2013, 6.5 years. So by the time they were almost 12, they'd finished their education. Now if you think about, number one, what you actually learn in primary school education, and number two, how that would impact the development of an economy, you can see that that is a real constraint on an economy. Whenever people are going to school and they're only spending 5 or 6 years in school and leaving when they're not even teenagers, they're barely in their teens. The government has ambitious plans, of course, the expected years of schooling, but you can see there's a total mismatch. By 2013, you're supposed to start school at 5 and leave probably the same time as you, 18, 19, something like that. But in 2013, you're starting school at 5 and you're leaving when you're around about 11 and a half, 12. So there's a real mismatch between what the expectations are and what's actually happening. And then this final one, the GNI per capita, so that's gross national income per capita. Anyone know, Lydia? What is the gross national income of the United States per capita? Any idea? No? Adam, have you any idea? Come on, Adam, have a guess, Adam. Well, it's not alright, Adam, have a guess, come on. It's about 45,000 US dollars or something like that. So you can see in relative terms, the Zambian economy and the inhabitants of Zambia are very, very poor relative to our own standards. Now the interesting point, and this is where I come back to your specification here, I reckon this is going to be 2A, is probably going to be on this particular data set. And where it says here PPP, what does that, does anyone know what anyone along this front row know what PPP stands for? No? PPP stands for Purchasing Power Parity. You may have heard before, those of you who subscribe to The Economist magazine, you may have heard of the Big Mac Index. And the Big Mac Index is used to measure the purchasing power of currencies globally. And when you measure something at PPP, it means that $2,898 in Zambia has the same purchasing power in Zambia as it does in America. You're comparing like with like in that respect. And so it's just telling you, that's what it's telling you basically, that this is a comparison of like with like. But there is, on the explain section of the trade and integration component of the specification, one of the bullet points is explain the meaning of purchasing power parity. I think, more than likely, potentially, that'll be the 4-mark question for this particular paper. The other thing in the trade and integration section is to explain what is meant by the HDI measure of welfare, the Human Development Index. And again, that's another potential question for this one. So that's your first sort of data set on this one. And these are the points which we've already mentioned, all hinting at a question about HDI. Right. I said this was split into 2 parts really, and so the other part of this is with regard to the terms of trade. You've got this terms of trade diagram here. Now, terms of trade, first of all, note that it's an index number. Now, let's have a little bit of a think about what index numbers are. Peter, what is an index number? Don't know? Michael?
Isn't that the one used when you're calculating the inflation rate with basket goods, so it takes it?
Okay, the CPI or the RPI are examples of an index number. The FTSE Stock Exchange Index, that is an example of an index number. Index numbers are used to calculate percentage changes from one point to the next. But why do economists, Lydia, why do economists use index numbers? They use index numbers because when we're dealing with economics, we're often dealing with enormous numbers. Whereas if you can use an index number, you can really make life simple for yourselves. So let me just give you a little example here of what we mean. So let's take the UK. Let's say it's year 1 and year 2. And year 1 is what's referred to as the base year. The base year, as you can tell from the chart, the base year, apologies. The base year always has a value of 100. Now, if I said to you, the value of UK GDP in year 1, let's just say it was £100. And then in year 2, the value of UK GDP was £150. Well, you can assign index numbers to these things. Let's make it 10 and 15, otherwise it'll look too similar actually. The base year always has an index value of 100. So this is the 100 here. You're then looking to measure the percentage change between the 2 years. So, Kane, is it on the end? Kane, what's the percentage change from 10 to 15? It's increased by 50%, exactly. You know that that is a 50% increase. So, Kane, on that basis, what would the value of the index number be in year 2? Exactly, it would be 150. So, the index numbers are measuring percentage changes from one point to another. However, if we then added a year 3, and let's say we had 18 for year 3, what's the percentage change from year 1 to year 3? Do you tell me what the percentage change is? 80%. Right. So what would the new index be? 180, correct. Okay. What's your name, sorry? Michael. What is the percentage change from year 1 to year 2?
50%.
What's the percentage change from year 1 to year 3?
Year 1, year 3 is 80%.
80%. So it's 100 to 150, that's 50%. 100 to 180, that's 80%. What's the percentage change from year 2 to year 3?
30%.
30%. Who agrees with 30%? Satya, do you agree with 30%? Do you agree with 30%? No. And this is the key point, ladies and gentlemen, when you're interpreting index number data. If one of the numbers is the base year, then you can express it as, right, that's 50%, because it's 100, the base year to 50. It's 100 to 80, that's 80%. But if neither of the years are the base year, this one, we've ruled this one out here because we're looking at here to here, we cannot just look at this data and say that that is a 30% change. How would we work it out, Satya? We would do the difference, which that's 180 minus 150, which gives you 30. Yeah? What would we divide that by? 150, which is 1 over 5, which is 20%. Okay? Now, the reason I go through all this rigmarole is because you may be asked to... Does this keep moving by itself? Yes? Really? You may be asked to interpret this data. And so here it says that the base year is the year 2000, has the value of 100. So what you cannot say is you cannot look at 2001, which is, let's say, 95, and let's take the last year, 2012, 195, let's say. You cannot just look at those two numbers and take one from the other. Why can you not simply take one from the other, Nathan?
Because 2001 is the base year.
Because 2001 is not the base year, 2012 is not the base year. So you've got to be really careful when you're doing your analysis of this. I'm sorry to labour that point, but I think it's a point worth stressing. So index numbers. You need to be able to do all of these things. Don't forget about the base year. You need to know what the equation is for calculating an index number. Sorry, not an index number, the terms of trade index. So it's the index of export prices divided by the index of import prices times 100. If it rises, so if it goes from 100 to 150, that's an improvement in the terms of trade. If it falls, it's a deterioration. And again, you don't need to get too technical about this, but again, I like to just say, really, to simplify, it's the price of exports over the price of imports. So, for example, if your export price, for example, has a price of 10, obviously you'd be talking about the kwacha, the Zambian kwacha, not sterling, but this is just by way of example, and the price of an import is 5. Well, obviously there, you could sell one export, and how many imports could you buy? 2, correct. Now, if your export prices went up, so this 10, rather than being 10, if this went up to 20, and your imports are still 5, then you can sell one export and bring in 4 imports. And so, the data set that you have in front of you, this one here, the general trend is upwards, basically. And so what this is telling you is that for every export that Zambia sells, they can now bring in more imports because they're able to sell their exports for greater revenue. There's more money coming in to Zambia, and hence that's an improvement in their terms of trade. So this movement here, although it does is a little bit volatile, this is an improvement, and it will be to the benefit of a developing nation like Zambia, because what do they need to import? They need to import primarily capital goods for development of their economy. So this is a significant positive movement. Obviously, if it goes the other direction, it's not so good. PES is another thing to mention on this, and Mr. Kelly was mentioning earlier, which I'm really glad that he did so. This is a synoptic unit. Feel free, feel at liberty to throw in microeconomics where you want and macroeconomics where you want. The exam board expects you to do that. So you need to be, you need to have all of those tools at your disposal, really. So when I'm talking here about PES, I'm talking about the price elasticity of supply of copper and the impact on prices. One of my colleagues who worked in Zambia, he was saying that the key reason that the Zambian economy has grown and become a lot more wealthy than it has in the last 10 years ago is primarily because of the huge demand for copper as the global economy has grown. Now again, let's think about this. The PES, so the price elasticity, so you're talking price and quantity here, the price elasticity of supply of copper is relatively, you would have to say, it's relatively inelastic. And so whenever you get big changes in demand, D1 to D2, which you would do during especially during the early noughties, so 2000s, quite small changes actually in demand would yield quite big increases in price. And of course, what prices is that going to be? P1 up to P2, that is going to be increases in the price probably of the export of copper. And so price elasticity of supply, I think, is an important aspect of this. And then just one final thing. The examiners, they always like to see sort of mention of relevant big theories. Mr. Madison was mentioning earlier the Marshall-Lerner condition. You'll have heard of Heckscher-Ohlin, I'm sure. So this is another one, the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis. And the basic premise of this, for those of you who haven't done it before, is that over time, the terms of trade of developing nations declines. Well, actually, this data that you've got in front of you shows quite the opposite. And sometimes it's good to just throw these things in to say, well, actually, this is totally converse to what traditional theory would say. This is showing an improvement in the terms of trade rather than a deterioration. And then lastly, just talking about the specific paragraphs. In line 1 of your extract material, it talks about, it doesn't mention it by this name, but this is what it means. At the very end of the first sentence, it says about the fact that a number of developing economies are dependent on these things for foreign exchange. Now, why do countries like Zambia need foreign exchange? Why do we hold in the central bank reserves? Why do we hold foreign currencies? We hold it for a number of reasons, but developing nations need these foreign exchange reserves to buy things from abroad. Now, if they don't have the foreign exchange, they cannot bring in the capital goods necessary for development. So, a very important factor to mention here would be this thing called the foreign exchange constraint. This is, we were mentioning globalization earlier, pros and cons and so on. Well, one of the things which might hold back a developing nation is this foreign exchange constraint. I would, however, mention, and it's fairly explicit in the extract, Zambia really does have all its eggs in one basket. It's just copper, copper, copper. The Zambian government have said for years that they're going to diversify and get into other areas, but they haven't done so. When the copper price starts to fall, they're in big trouble. So, having all your eggs in one basket like this is poor. You're told about these revenues and so on. And then what does the final paragraph tell us? It's quite a tricky little paragraph, actually, this one. And again, there's micro and there's macro in here. In my view, there's micro and there's macro in here. As follows, really. So, you're told here halfway down, it talks about, this was seen by many as part of a trend in Africa towards what's known as resource nationalisation. And I think that there's potential here, and there's certainly scope to get into, and we don't have time to get into it today, but there's certainly scope to get into here a little bit of analysis with regard to the fact that nationalised industries are inherently very inefficient, whereas privatised industries, profit-seeking, tend to be much more efficient. So why on earth would the Zambian government want to renationalise and take these things back under state control? My colleague who's worked in Zambia was saying the only reason that they're wanting to do it is because they can then siphon off lots more of the revenue for themselves. So it's for corruption, really, rather than for the development of the economy. So there's that whole privatisation, nationalisation debate. I would also mention, I'm not sure if you've mentioned before, but the whole aspect of ex-efficiency and ex-inefficiency. Organisations, public sector organisations, nationalised industries tend to be highly ex-inefficient, so they don't keep their costs as low as they possibly could do. It's another thing to mention. And then the supply side fiscal policies, really, I want to leave that to talk about that when we come to extract 5, because it's more relevant there. Same with that bullet point. So I think I'll, in view of the time actually, we best leave it at that. So that is extract 3. So Mr. Madison's is Mr. Madison here? Has he gone home? Oh yes. He's going to run through extract 4, and we're probably going to be have to fairly swift. I think on extract 5.
Alright, okay everyone, so you can have a look at extract 4 for me. And I've entitled it Remittances because that plays a large part in terms of the explanation to the extract, and it also comes up on the nice diagram that we have there. So, in your groups, just so you get chatting after lunch, what I would like you to do is come up, and you can work in pairs in your groups, or 4 or 5 here, come up with a nice definition of remittances without using the letter A. So definition for remittances, but you're not allowed to use the letter A. So yeah, be a bit more clear. Has to be a coherent sentence as well. Right. Anybody got any nice definition without using the letter A? Giving money to your home country, yeah. There we go. Well, I've used letter A because, you know, I'm a teacher, so I'm allowed. So, what are remittances? So, it is, just in case you're unaware, when migrants send home part of their earnings in the form of either cash or goods to support their family. And remittances are playing a huge role in the development of developing economies. They really are a main source of finance for these countries to enable these countries to develop HDI index that we talked about on the last extract and other methods of development as well. So they tend to be counter-cyclical and they increase. So counter-cyclical means basically that when something goes wrong, something goes bad, so when there's a natural disaster, etc., they will actually increase, whereas private capital flows tend to decrease because businesses tend to pull out slightly, whereas when there's a disaster, something like that, remittances will go up. Alright, just to link it back to the spec from what we did before lunch, there's a few areas where it flashes up. Again, first page of your extract, where, I'm just going to borrow this, where it's got the OCR and then it's got the introduction. Here there. If you have a look at the 4th paragraph down where it talks about the greater mobility of labour has increased financial flows, and it talks about ODA and it talks about the form of remittances. So it's likely that remittances will come up in your exam. Alright, so again,